If you want to read better and think more clearly and understand the ideas shaping our world, then this might be for you. You should join the Dr. John Patrick Book Club. It's a private online community where we read great books together and learn how to think, not just what to think. Inside, you're going to have access to Dr. John Patrick as we work through books and ask questions. If you've ever felt like there are books you should be reading or ideas that you want to understand better, but you didn't want to do it alone, this is a good place to start. You can find the link in the show notes or the description below to join.
Hello, everyone. John Patrick in snowy Ottawa. Well, outside Ottawa, actually. This week has been an interesting set of conjunctions for me. So many things happening that have interacting tentacles, if you like. Just to list them and then perhaps try and make some sense of them. John 15, the vine, has been on my mind for quite some time, regularly. And this week I stumbled on a wonderfully effective recreation of Spurgeon preaching on the vine. Obviously, they only had the text, but they read it on YouTube, and it reminded me of how far we have fallen in the vast majority of sermons. You can find it on YouTube. I recommend it. It's it's an hour long or thereabouts. After all, it was the 1890s. It fits in with something else that's been bothering me from Isaiah 11, the promise that the Messiah, when he comes, will delight in the fear of the Lord. And the relationship between us having a sense of the awe and majesty of God, who deigns to respond to us and even loves us. If he were to turn up in a fraction of his revealed glory, we'd be flat on our faces. But we should delight in that reality that we'll be tough enough to take it when the time comes. You can see the connections growing there. And in my wandering mind, the next connection during that week was looking around the world at the anarchy that is happening everywhere. Dostoevsky came in. If there is no God, then everything is permissible, says Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov, of which more later, but I've had a few emails over time asking me to say more about the books that have mattered to me, and I have not been very dutiful about that. One of my good friends who read the Brothers Karamazov and said she could hardly read it. She'll never read it again, which is very sad in a way, but I understand there's some training for novels of that sort. Sally and I were talking, we both read it when we were late teens, early 20s at some point. It must have been late teens, I think. And we couldn't possibly have really understood it at that time. And I doubt if I really understand it now. Well, I don't. I mean, Dostoevsky is a towering figure, but there's certainly a lot to be got out of that book. And we are starting a book project from the website that you're plugged into now, for those who want to talk in a smaller group about books. And we'll actually start with the Abolition of Man in February. There are enough people who say they want to do it. We'll see how it goes. Somehow we've got to do something about the disaster of the lack of serious reading in the church. I mean, if there was a revival now, we'd be in no fit state to disciple the people who have an interaction with Christ and their lives are changed, and then they start looking around for older brothers and sisters in the faith who've lived the life a long while and have the wisdom that they know they need. And, well, it's hard to find such people. So, as well as the Abolition of Man, the Brothers Karamazov will turn up in that book project, probably the second book we look at. I mean, there's almost hubris on my part to even think that I don't think that I could say very much about it other than allowing Dostoevsky to get inside your head, perhaps. And certainly for physicians to read just Ivan and Alyosha's interaction over the appalling treatment of children by adults in the history of the world, and the Grand Inquisitor, they come one after the other in the Brothers Karamazov. If you've never read it, just read those first, or just read the Grand Inquisitor. But I think, particularly for a physician or anybody who's working with children and the abuse of children, Ivan's in-your-face attack on Alyosha's faith, because he said, I can't respectfully want to join a club that has a leader who allows these things to happen. It's a fair question. And of course, what's been going on during this last week or two, well, it's longer than that, actually. It's been going on quite some time, but really hitting the headlines now in Iran. And who would I end up watching at one point but John Lennox talking about Daniel. And of course, Daniel was taken from Israel, probably could well have been castrated, one doesn't know. That was the standard practice, and became an advisor in due course to Nebuchadnezzar, and then when Nebuchadnezzar died, Belshazzar had to interact with him. And he survived all those ups and downs with his three friends. And John Lennox does an absolutely masterful account of that, and draws out all its applications for today. Just put John Lennox, Norwegian students, Daniel, and you should find 3 brilliant videos. I want a little later to say in this podcast to talk a bit about what I look upon as the more important backdrop to Iran, that the politicians are really not engaging with, because they're blind. When the leaders lack vision, the people perish. That's where we are at the moment. My interactions with students over the last little while have been increasingly sad, because there's no depth. We have an education system that has got lost. I just finished yesterday a short article. I write a quarterly article for the American Christian Medical Dental Association. And this one, actually, that I finished yesterday, starts with the quotation from Dostoevsky, "If there is no God, then everything is permissible." That's where we're getting to. The only question now is the question of authority, and the only authority most students accept is their own. No higher idea present. Wisdom is non-existent. It's a word that doesn't enter into their education, and doesn't probably get discussed very often at home either. Wisdom. Without wisdom, the people perish. So, how to stitch those bits and pieces together, I'm not sure that I can, but I will try. But I want to start with what I think is one of the most interesting phenomena going on over the last few years, and that is the steady collapse of the Muslim apologists, who always had a very naive approach to apologetics, but they had one and we had none at all, so no one taught us how to engage with Muslims at all. They actually depend upon the hadiths, which are hundreds of years after Muhammad allegedly was, what shall I say, allegedly is a harsh word, but it's probably at the moment a perfectly valid one. So we have nothing from the 6th century, nothing. No documentation of any sort. The hadiths were written hundreds of years later, and the Quran was put together by the caliphs about roughly 200 years after the time Muhammad was said to be around. So in other words, unlike the Christian gospel, in which the New Testament is written by eyewitnesses and direct friends of eyewitnesses, it's close, it's real, and it's well documented. And you can find secular responses to Christianity in all sorts of writings. Nobody seriously doubts that something spectacular happened in Israel. The evidence that the resurrection happened is good evidence. And even when I was growing up, we were taught those things well by people like F.F. Bruce in his wonderful little booklet of many years ago, Are the New Testament Documents Reliable? And it's only got better since. Yes, they are. The sensible thing is to take them seriously and think about them, which we stopped doing roughly in the 1960s. It's a recurring theme in this podcast, but one that one needs to go on saying until something happens. We need the Bible in the education system of the Western world, not as a religious document, but as a historical document which was believed to be true by the vast majority of the Judeo-Christian community for 1,000 years. For the Jewish community, longer, 3,000 years, more even. That's just historical fact. The key ideas that developed about how we should govern ourselves, even that wonderful invention, common law, came out of a way of thinking about humanity by Alfred and his sons that gave us a way to deal with power that has not been superseded. It was brilliant. And yet law schools don't even teach the history of common law in many cases. Hopefully they still do it in Britain, but I doubt it. We're losing our historical content. But the worst example, of course, was the 1960s removal by pressure from the liberal progressive elite who thought that they knew better than everyone else how the world should be. So history was dismissed as a serious topic, and what mattered was the political narrative. And they had become tacit atheists without knowing it and without thinking about whether it was a defensible position. But they started behaving as though it was true. And so they bought into the myth of multiculturalism, utterly, in my view, an utterly stupid idea. And we're paying the price for it all over the place now. The Muslims held on to their narrative, despite its utter incoherence on many points. So they have more of a community than the post-Christian world has, but it's changing. I mean, there is clear evidence that serious changes are occurring. Conversions into active Christianity are happening over a wide spectrum of society, from the top levels of intellectual performance. I mean, just go and listen to Peter Robinson's interviews over the last few years on uncommon knowledge at the Hoover Institute. Wonderful stuff to listen to. But many younger generation, compared to me, are seriously recognizing, oh dear, I made a bad mistake. Tom Holland would be perhaps the most obvious and articulate and, what's the word I want? Genuine account of returning to the Christian faith that he was fortunate enough to be taught when he was young, But then it came alive because he realized at the heart of what he liked doing history, the story of Judeo-Christian thought was actually what had given him everything he really needed. Another example from an entirely different, from a Hindu background, would be wonderful. He sat in my house and talked to me, and his name at the moment won't come back, but a Hindu guy who went to university in India and loved what was happening there and slowly began to realize everything that he really enjoyed, he owed to the Christians. And so he wrote a book about the Bible, which provided the basis for everything that he loved. And he spent his life as a Christian living with the poor and helping them to defend themselves against aggressive landowners who trying to turn them basically into serfs. Another wonderful example of the way faith comes in at a very practical level. My favorite story about him, the name will come back sometime during this podcast, was his first visit to Holland, and he was staying with a Christian guy there, and when they looked in the fridge, they'd run out of milk. He said, we'll just go across the road to the farm and get some. So they walked across the road to a dairy farm. There was nobody around. They walked into the milking area, and the guy had brought a jug with him, and he filled up his jug, and then he reached for a box and put some money in it and put the box back. And my good friend said, "Wow, that's amazing." And the Christian guy said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, if this was India, there'd be no money in the box, no milk, and probably no cows, because nobody was guarding them, nobody was looking after them." That way of living, which I remember too, has now gone. I mean, now we have cameras everywhere, locks and all the rest, and violence and crime have increased. When you look for technological solutions to moral problems, don't expect success. You've reached the stage now where Darwin has won at one level, and from Darwin's point of view, the only question, there is no other, is, does this action benefit my genes, my immediate family, or not? That's all. It's a purely consequential judgment with no absolute right or wrong. I should steal from you if the opportunity is there and there's no possibility of me being caught, then on a Darwinian basis, that's a good way to live. That's the way nature works. Nature red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson put it later. But we all know that's not true. We are moved by acts of selfless heroism. I've been watching quite a lot of stories about the Second World War. I'm not quite sure why, but they've become very interesting to me, and of the incredible heroism that happened. The greatest generation, ordinary people, particularly Canadians, actually, because that's when the Second World War is when they showed incredible courage. They were amongst the most effective fighters in the Second World War. And they were ordinary kids who'd signed up from the prairies and across Canada to fight the Nazis. And they did it at great cost. I'm reminded of it regularly because the bridge that I go over on the way into Ottawa is a memorial to the Vimy Ridge experience. Why did they do it? They volunteered to do it. They signed up. There's something deep in us, particularly, I think, the male, that is looking for that ability, that opportunity to be courageous. Courage is a wonderful thing. And the amazing thing about the Christian story is that that's what impressed the Roman world. First of all, they saw that these Christians loved one another. They cared for one another in a way that was not normal. And secondly, they accepted martyrdom rather than deny the Lord they had never seen but knew. knowing. I mean, the ultimate summary of Christ, in a way, I came that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. Know. Not know of, but know. That's what we all want, isn't it? And we often take a long route round to growing into that. That sermon by Spurgeon on the vine attracted me because I had been thinking about it just from one particular bit of it, where he says, our Lord says, you can do anything if I'm in it, but without me, you can't do anything of any substance, any importance. That's rather frightening, isn't it? We like to think how important we are, but it's only an importance that can come through the recognition that we're all sinners. We all know what is good. Our problem is with the commission of the good and the avoidance of evil. And the only way that happens is the story of the vine. I am the vine, you are the branches. My Father is the one who does the pruning, and expect pruning, which will not be pleasant at the time, but yields the peaceable fruits of righteousness over time. What Spurgeon does with that chapter is a really stunning example of somebody who has lived inside the Word for a long while. And that's what he's trying to say, that if you want to know in that kind of way, you need to stay close to abide. And that fits in with that Isaiah statement that your likes and dislikes will change. And ultimately, fearing the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Not fear in a bad sense. Not I'm terribly frightened, but this is awesome fear. It's different. We know something of it in our own human environment. I mean, to pull the trigger on a powerful weapon and know that you're going to kill a lot of people is awesome power. And we don't really have the means to help people who've been in battle to process when they get back, which is why they do so badly. Counselling as such is not going to go anywhere on that, because the question is so much bigger. Why am I here? Did I do what was right? Only if you can put it into a context that's eternal rather than purely temporal. And that's what Spurgeon does beautifully. Jesus talks about joy, which is another aspect of the Christian life which has been bugging me a lot, always has. Ever since I heard Lloyd Jones many years ago. I think I heard him, or did I read him? It doesn't really matter in a way. But in talking about 1 Peter, and there's an amazing verse in the first chapter. Peter is writing to people he's never met, who had been abused big time by Nero and his ilk, and they'd been kicked out of Rome, were refugees. That's if they survived Nero without being turned into a torch for the garden. I mean, he dipped Christians in tar and then nailed them to a cross and lit them to provide light for his garden parties. I mean, that is so horrible, cruel and nasty. We try to pretend it never happened, but it did. It did. Well documented. And Peter, writing these people now in exile, he says, I know you have suffered various trials. What do you mean, Peter? Various trials? I mean, those are devastating experiences. But Peter says, no, they're not. I know you have experienced various trials. He never met them, but he said, but I also know that you live with a joy beyond words. Wow. Peter knew that the church was made up of people who lived with a joy beyond words. Can I honestly say that? Well, I can honestly say that I have known it a few times, but I would love it to be more of a daily experience. But what the parable of the vine says is this only comes about as you abide in me. And I always used to hear sermons when I was a child. People wanted to abide in Christ, but what does it mean? Well, at the very least, it means that the scriptures and prayer have to be central. And as that grows, yes, there is a joy which is not essentially subjective. It's objective. It's not something that comes from within you in response to the outside. It's something outside that comes to you in a way that you cannot deny. The peace of the Lord be always with you. It's not something you manufactured. And Christ says, I want to be with you in that way. And the way you do it is by being obedient. The essence of love is not subjective. If you love me, keep my commandments. It's an astonishingly uncharacteristic way of expressing that in the 20th century. So what's happening in the Western world, and particularly in the Islamic world, is there's an awful lot, awful in the sense of awesome, a lot of people from a Muslim background who are having experiences of God, often of Christ, often in a dream. And it's so powerful that it changes their lives, and they don't even mind if they get murdered for it. Because leaving Islam carries a death sentence in formal Islam. It's certainly a religion, not of peace, but of fear of the Ayatollahs, but it's breaking down. Iran has probably got one of the highest conversion rates into Christianity in the world, and what's happening at the moment there, where people are just taking to the streets. Who knows what is going to happen? But the power of the theocracy, they may have enough firepower and malice to murder their own people enough to shut them down again, but that won't bring them back to the mosque, will it? The vast majority of the young people now don't want anything to do with the mosque and the Ayatollahs. And what's happening apologetically, at long last, over the last 20 years, Christians have stopped preaching a simple gospel as though that was all that was needed. The simple gospel does need to be taught, but we also have to be ready to give a reason for our faith, which is also in Peter, and it's being done better and better. And I think Jay Smith and David Wood are probably two of the leading exponents of this, and they've been doing it for a good many years now, and getting threatened for it. And certainly in Jay Smith's account of his experiences, he's been beaten up several times and rescued by unknown people. But essentially, Jay Smith's approach is the man, the book, and the place. What academically supportable documents do we have to support the narrative of Mecca in the Quran, that it's where where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs, were allegedly all went to Mecca and died there? There's absolutely no evidence of that. In fact, in 6th century maps, you can't find Mecca on the map. That story has no documentary evidence to back it up. And making it even worse in the recent past, every mosque has a pointer to Mecca to pray, except that in mosques that were older than AD 1000, it doesn't point to Mecca, it points to Petra. Interesting, to say the very least. So Mecca is a very unlikely story, but it's there. But they maintain that the Quran is absolutely true and absolutely preserved. So what the caliphs did a couple of hundred years after Islam got going was to destroy all the documents that didn't agree with one another, because the caliph had a problem that his soldiers from different parts of his empire would fight over what they said the Quran contained. And he said, this won't do, we need a unitary religion. And so they produced it by destroying a lot of documents. But of course, if people thought they'd got some ancient document, they didn't destroy it. And now many of them have been discovered, so it's no longer an issue. That there's no question the Quran has not been perfectly preserved, and there are more different readings in the very short Quran compared to the very long New Testament, relative in space. But the New Testament always said, this is a human account of what went on with all the human fallibilities involved. So Peter and Paul were fighting it out over things that's always been the case, because mere human vessels are used by God, and we make sense of our experiences over time. But the Quran was not supposed to be like that, but it is. The Hadiths were many hundreds of years after the alleged lifetime of Muhammad. So the place Mecca hasn't survived, the book hasn't survived, and the evidence for the man is distinctly weak when you start looking at it at all seriously. So it's not surprising that thoughtful young people who, looking at the world around them and not liking the way it works, are getting upset. Islam was impervious to Christianity for centuries because its people were poor and the Imam was powerful. And it was the cultural base, and if you went against it, it was hard times for you. I mean, in Britain today, more than 1,000 Muslim girls are killed every year because they've offended their father's sense of honor by the way they dressed or spoke or acted. And in most cases, those murders are not solved because the community looks solid. But it's in the Western world, and the results of this behavior and the grooming gangs and the like are actually stirring up ordinary people. The elite living in their gated communities pretend it's not there, or in one way or another refuse to engage. No, it's happened on the grand scale, and we know who some of the people are, and they are all Muslims. So these things are undermining the Muslim hegemony. But most importantly, the internet. Missionaries didn't make much progress. A few people learnt, and some got converted, but very few. But the internet suddenly shows Muslims all around the world, because you go to the poorest parts of Africa and there are people with cell phones. And I'm sure it's true in Pakistan as well. I've never been to Pakistan. But the internet is everywhere. So women in particular can look at the lives that are being lived by women in other places and look at their own lives. And there are things they want. I mean, the pictures this week from Iran of women dancing around in brightly coloured dresses and no hijabs. I hope they don't get murdered for it, but their glee and their enjoyment of clothes that they like, instead of being turned into black, voiceless ghosts wandering around who expect to be beaten by their husbands. So this is not going to survive. It's not an accident that many, many young people looking at the world as it could be and what theirs is, want some of the goodies of the world. We all are thing attracted, aren't we? That's the Western problem, avarice. The winner is not the man who dies with the most toys, is he? That's where we're at the moment. So, watching the data and pictures that are coming out of Iran is astonishing. What one worries about is what comes next, because government is necessary. Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor talks about the church and the nature of control and the fact that people want to be controlled. The Grand Inquisitor is an amazing story. Go read it. But Daniel, I'm going to finish with that because the time is already up. I've been going on too long. I stumbled across John Lennox talking to Norwegian students about Daniel. And I think I talked about this last week. It doesn't matter. It bears repeating. Daniel and his friends were taken from Israel and into Persia. The Medes and the Persians did their stuff. And those 4 young men stayed faithful to what they had learned. And we know the stories. And there are even stories being repeated in the 21st century of Christians in the Muslim world being burned and not burned. The experience of Belshazzar and the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. There are claims that they've happened again. They happened once, they could happen again. But these young men stayed faithful to their God. And as John Lennox points out, something I didn't know, that the book of Daniel is written in 2 languages. It's written in Hebrew, but it's also written in the standard dominant language of the time in Persian. I've forgotten the name of it. And it looks as though, with Daniel's help, Nebuchadnezzar wrote one of the 4th chapter, I think it is, when he was humbled and then brought back. And he recognized that he was not the ultimate power. And when he passed, and the arrogant Belshazzar profaned the sacred vessels of the Jews for an orgy, and the hand wrote on the wall when they were all drunk. Terrifying message. Many, many tikul yufasin. You, Belshazzar, have been weighed in the balances and found wanting, underweight. You and your kingdom will disappear tonight. We know the date. The canals in which he trusted were drained that night, and that was the end of his kingdom. Lost, weighed in the balances and found wanting. Most people would not recognize the source of that commonplace phrase in the past, quite common in English literature, not known by modern students. The backdrop that John Lennox so beautifully explains, that gave steel to the lives, the backbone of Daniel and his friends, is still available. It's still going on. So we should be praying about it, that Iran will not tip into anarchy, but hopefully will make a step towards recognizing Christ. That would be the best thing that could happen to Iran. So we should pray about it. And with that, I see I'm already hitting the hour. We spent quite a lot of time before we started this talking about starting a more intimate arrangement on Zoom where in small groups we could talk to one another about books. So hoping to start in February with a small Zoom group, and I think I would like to start with the Abolition of Man. So if you're interested in doing it, there'll be stuff here from Craig, who runs it, telling you how you can sign up. But step one is to get yourself a copy of the Abolition of Man and read it. But the easy way to do it would be to go to quotations from C.S. Lewis from the Abolition of Man, and then go and look those up and see which ones strike a chord with you, so that when we get together we can at least begin by finding out which of the many amazing bits of that very short book, just about 120 pages in my edition, which ones struck you. I have 2 or 3 that I use time and time again, so we have enough to talk about there. So meanwhile, go and pray for Iran, and we'll look forward to meeting again. Lord be with you.